Masechet Ketubot Daf Samech Aleph. We're continuing to analyze the various obligations that a wife has to her husband in a marriage. 7 mentioned in the Mishnah. There are others also, like making the bed and serving wine to her husband, that we'll speak about. So now we're discussing nursing. Rav Huna badak lan Rav Huna bar Chinena. So this was a test that Rav Huna bar Chinena gave to his students. So let's see what the test was. He omedet lehanik v'hu omer shelo lehanik. In the usual case, the husband will want his wife to nurse. But what if it's not the usual case, where the wife, she says, I want to nurse the baby, but the husband says, I don't want you to nurse. I'm going to hire a wet nurse, and I don't want you to do it. Maybe because she'll be up all night, or she'll be tired, whatever the reason. Sham'in la, we listen to her. In other words, the husband does not have a right to refuse, to prohibit his wife from nursing. If she wants to nurse, she has a right to do so. Why? Saradi dao, because she's the one that will be suffering. If she's not nursing, that will feel painful to her, and therefore it's her body, it's her right. Hu omer lehanik v'hi omeret shelo lehanik mahu. But what if he says, I want you to nurse, and she says, no, it's too much work, it's too, I have to be up all night, and she doesn't want to. What about that case? Kol hecha delav urcha shom'in la. He orcha vehu lav orcha mai. So in this case, it depends on what the general custom is in that area, in that place, in that family. If it's a place where people are not accustomed to nurse their own children, meaning they're a higher class, and so they give it out to a wet nurse, it's so much easier to hire a wet nurse. So in that case, we have to listen to her. If that's the general practice, and she doesn't want to, then we have to follow what the general practice is and give her that luxury. But if, let's say, it's in her family, the custom is to nurse. In other words, her family is lower class. They can't afford wet nurses. Vehu lav orche mai. But in his family, they are wealthier and they generally hire wet nurses. So can she demand to be treated on the higher level of his family? Batar dida azlinan or batar dida azlinan? Do we follow his wishes and she has to follow her custom, or do we follow her wishes because she wants to follow his custom? So that was the test, and here's the answer to the test. Upashitna le meha ola imo ve'ena yoredet imo. A principle we've seen already, that she rises to his level and she does not descend to his level. If the man is from a higher class, then she has to be treated according to the higher class. Whereas if she is the higher class, then the man has to anyway treat her with the higher class. The wife wins out either way. She gets the benefit of either the more luxurious way of life of his family or her family. Amar Rav Huna mai kera'a. And what's the source that the man has to treat his wife on a higher level either way? From vehi be'ulat ba'al. This is regarding Avimelech, who took Sarai, and then he says, an angel says, why'd you take her? She is be'ulat ba'al, she is married. She is a man's wife. But it's an unusual way to say it. Why say be'ulat ba'al? Ba'aliyatosha ba'al, a creative derasha, that you have to treat her in the height, the ascension, the aliyah of her husband. So that's how you know that she gets lifted up. Velo bedidato shel baal, and she does not get placed down if the husband is from a lower background. Rabbi Elazar Amar Mehacha, or an alternative source, Kihi Haita Em Kol Hai. Regarding Chava, says she was the mother of all living beings. Lechaim nitena velo lesar nitena. She was given to the husband for living with him and for having children with him, but not to suffer pain with him. And so if she's used to a higher standard of living, then he has to provide that for her. Yes, she has to be with him and have children with him, but she doesn't have to lower herself to suffer down on his level. Okay, Hichnisa lo shivcha. The Mishnah mentioned that if she does not have any maidservant, she has to perform these 7 tasks. But if she does bring in one maidservant, then she can offload the requirements of grinding, baking, and washing. Okay, ha sha'ara abda, but we can infer from that the other 4 items the wife still has to do. But why? V'temale ailit lach iteta behari kai. She should say, I brought you a woman in my place. She has a dowry, and she brought in a maidservant, so let the maidservant do all 7 items, and she can do nothing. Why does she still have to do 4 of them? And the answer is Mishum Damar La, because the husband can say to her, Ha tarcha lididi uldida kamedidach man tarach. Yes, you brought a maidservant, and the maidservant will do work for me, the husband, and for herself, because she also, the maidservant herself, has needs. But who's going to do your work? In other words, beforehand, if there's no maidservants, there's only 2 people. So the wife can do all those chores sufficient for 2 people's needs. But now there are 3 people and living in the house. So there's more work that needs to be done. So the maid cannot do the work for all 3 people. She can only do 3 out of the 7 tasks. All right. Shetaim ena mebashelet ve'ena meneket. If menika. If she brings in 2 maids, then the wife will not need to cook or nurse either. That takes care of 5 of the items, and there's only 2 left. Ha sha'ada abda, but the other 2, the wife still has to do. V'temale ailit lach iteta achariti tetarcha lididi uldida v'chada lididach uldida. But why does she need to work at all? Why can't the wife say to her husband, listen, I brought yet another maid, and she can do the work for me and for herself, and the other maid can do the work for you and for herself, and therefore I should not have to do any work at all. In other words, now there's going to be 4 people living in the house, but 2 maids should be able to fulfill everything for 4 people. It makes sense, right? If you have only 2 people in the house, husband and wife, the wife can take care of all these chores for 2 people, so 1 for 2. So therefore, if you have 2 maids, they should be able to fulfill everything for 4 people. And the answer here is Mishum Damar La Kame Orche Ufarche Mantarach. Yeah, but what about the guests and the wayfarers? Oreach sounds like a guest that stays for a while. Parche means he flies away. Someone who comes just for a short stay. The point is that once you have a household with maids, and so these are wealthier people, it's more likely that they're going to have guests. And so, expecting that guests are going to come, the maids are going to have to tend to the guests, and so the wife is still going to have to do a couple of tasks. All right, next step. Shalosh ena masa'at hamita. If she brings in 3, then she doesn't need to make the bed, and she doesn't need to spin the wool either. She doesn't have to do any of the 7 tasks mentioned in the Mishnah, but there are other tasks that are not mentioned in the Mishnah, like making the bed and things like that she would still have to do. Ha sha'ara abda, so other things, the regular smaller tasks, she has to continue to do, even though she has three maids. Why? V'temale ailit lach acharite leorche ufarche. She can say, hey, now I brought yet a 3rd maid, and that she can take care of any guests that come. So why should we make the wife do anything at all? How come with just 3? Why can't she sit like on a throne? Mishum de amar la nafesh bene beta nafesh urche uparche. Because the husband will say, listen, when we have now even more people, we're going to end up having more guests. People like inviting guests. It's hard if you don't have any help to have guests, so you won't have guests so often. But if you have 3 maids, then he's going to want to invite guests often, a lot of guests. And so we're going to need the 3 maids to tend to the guests. And so you're still going to have to do some of the small jobs. Okay, if so, then 4 also. When someone has 4 maids, they're going to also invite a lot of guests. And so why don't you say that she still has to do the small tasks like making the bed? When there's 4, the Mishnah says there's 4 maids, then she can sit on the throne and do nothing. How come? How come we don't tend to worry about more guests? And the answer is, 4 is already a lot of maids, and they can assist each other, even if 1 or 2 are tending to the guests. guests. The other ones will fill in and bake the bread and make the beds and all that. So 4 is sufficient to run an entire household, even when there are many guests. Okay, Amar Rav Nachman, v'itema Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachmani, lo hichnisa lo mamash, ela kevan shere'uya lehachnis, af al pi shelo hichnisa. When we say that she brings in a maidservant when she gets married, part of her dowry, or something that she already owns, this doesn't mean literally that she actually has to have a maidservant there, a physical person that she brings in, but rather that her dowry is sufficiently large that they could hire someone to take care of those chores. Tana, echad shechnisa lo, ve'echad shesimsema lo mishelaha. And the Braita adds yet another case where she would, which is equivalent, which is that even if the dowry is not so large that it could afford a maidservant, but she reduces her own needs. She makes her own budget. If it would usually be, if her budget that she brings in is $1,000 a week, and she says, listen, I'm going to not shop and eat very little. I'm only going to spend $300. And so that will allow the other $700 for a maid servant. Then that is fine. So that would be equivalent of her bringing in an extra amount that would be above her budget. That would be for a maidservant. Okay. Arba yoshebet bekatedra. Mishnah said if she has 4, then she can sit in a nice royal throne and not do any work. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Hananya Amar Rav Huna. Remember this name because we're going to see a whole series of statements by him. אף על פי שמרו יושבת בקתדרה, אבל מוזגת לו כוס ומסעת לו את המיטה, ומרחסת לו פניו, ידיו ורגליו. Rav Huna here teaches that even if she brings in 4 maidservants and she's sitting on the throne, nevertheless there are still some things that a wife must do for her husband, because these are not household chores, but rather these are personal, intimate things that a wife does to show her affection to her husband. And that would include mixing his cup, mixing the wine with water, serving him the wine, and making his bed. Now we have to clarify, because making the bed was one of the 7, that now once she brings in 3 maidservants, she is exempt from making the bed. So why is it here that even with 4, she still has to make the bed? So Rishonim explain that perhaps there's 2 different types of bed preparation. Just like today, in the morning we'll make the bed, but then you go to a fancy hotel, and in the late afternoon they'll turn down the bed. So probably back then also they used the beds, and then they probably put them away during the day so that they didn't have so many bedrooms, so that they could use the room, and then they bring out the bed again and make the bed and turn it down. So the heavy lifting of the preparation of the beds, that will be done by maidservants, but the preparation of the bed probably in front of the husband as they're before they're going to sleep, that should be done by the wife, even if she has 4 maidservants. That's an act that shows her affection, and also washing his face, hands, and feet. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Chinan Amar Rav Huna. Same sage says something else. Kol melachot she'isha osa leba'ala, nida osa leba'ala, chutz b'mezigat hakos v'atzat hamita, v'alchasat panav yadav ve'raglav. Any of actions that a woman must do for her husband while she's nidah, she has to continue doing those things, except for these acts that are intimate, pouring wine, making the bed, and washing his hands, head, face, hands, and feet. Because she's nidah, if they're going to do those acts of affection, it may lead to them being together, so therefore she has to keep away from that during the time of nidah. The problem making the bed is only if he is there, he's present in the room. But if he's not there, then that's not going to lead to anything. That's not an intimate act. So this is a good hint that there are in fact at least 2 different stages and types of making the bed. Mezigat hakos shemur mechalefa ledebitu bidad dismala. So even though she cannot pour the wine, mix the wine for him in a regular way, these various Amoraim would do it in an unusual way. So Shemuel's wife would change the usual way, and she would pour with her left hand. And so that made a sign that was, left hand, yeah, this is time of Nidah. And that would be a way of separating. Abaye mancha le'apuma dechuba, Rabba be'sadya, Rapapa ashar shifa. Or even if they would mix it in the usual way, Abaye's wife would place it on top of a barrel, not on the table in front of him, or on his pillow. Rapapa would put it on the bench, and that way all these were unusual ways, so that they remember, this is Nidah time, and it would not lead to more affection. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Chananya Amar Rav Huna Hakol Mashhin Bifnei Hashamash. So this has nothing to do with wives anymore, but rather with how one should treat the waiter. But it's by the same sage, Rav Yitzchak bar Chananya, in the name of Rav Huna, and says here that all foods can be withheld from the waiter. Chutz mi basar v'yayin. In other words, the waiter is bringing around lots of food, and the waiter is serving the guests. The waiter does not need. You don't have to give the waiter the food. The waiter can wait till later when he's done, and then he'll eat from those foods, except for meat and wine, because meat and wine are very savory, and the waiter, if he sees everybody else eating and drinking wine, and he's not, he's going to feel bad. He's going to suffer hunger pangs that can be serious, as we're going to see. And so therefore, the waiter, you have to allow the waiter to take part in the meat and wine while he's serving it. Amar Rav Chisda basar shamen v'yayin yashan. Rav Chisda says not just any meat and wine, but only fatty meat. They liked fatty meat back then, and aged wine. That is was going to make him really salivate. If it's just regular plain old wine, then no big deal. Amar Rava basar shamen kol hashana kula yayin yashan b'tukvat Tammuz. Rava attenuates further, says fatty meat is something that is going to be scrumptious, and you have to share that with the waiter while he's serving. That's true all year round. But regarding the old wine, that's only in the summertime when the aroma spreads throughout the air more. Then he's going to need to drink. But in the winter time, then the aroma is not so strong, so he'll be able to wait till after he finishes serving. Amar Rav Anan bar Tachlifa hava kaimna kameh de Mor Shemuel vaitule tabshila de arde vilav di havli istakeni. We see from here that the waiters, these were not like hired lowly people, outsiders, but rather the waiters were themselves the sages. The sages' students would serve their masters, or sages would serve each other. Maybe they would take turns. And so here, Rav Anan bar Tachlifa, he was waiting on Mor Shemuel, who was of higher stature, and they cooked this dish of mushrooms, and he really liked this dish. Shemuel, we know, liked mushrooms. It was a dessert for him, and if not, Rav Anan says, if he didn't give me some, I would have been in danger, sakana, because I was really craving it. So thankfully, he followed this halacha and shared it. Amar Rav Asher, hava kaimna kameh de Rav Kahana, vaitule gargelide. Actually, he went beyond the halacha, because the halacha just says meat and wine. But this, some people really like a particular dish, so that also should be shared with the waiter. So avakimna kameh de Rav Kahana. Rav Asher was serving Rav Kahana. So again, here it's a later Rav Asher, 6th generation, serving Rav Kahana, who was a teacher. And vaitule gargile de lifta, and they brought this turnip dish in vinegar, bechala. V'lavdi habli istakani. If he didn't give me, I would have been in danger, because the smell was so delicious. Rapapa amar afilu temarta tehinu nita. Even a fragrant date, which date is not such a fancy thing, but they would put make these dates fragrant, and you smell it, and so you should offer it to the waiter. So what they have in common is anything that has an aroma, has a pungent taste, that if one is serving it, then the guest should allow the waiter to take part at the same time. Abu bar Ihi u'Minyamin bar Ihi. He had these two sages that were brothers. Chad safeh mikol mina umina v'chad safeh mechad mina. One of them would give his waiter every type of food, every dish that the waiter came out, he would say, take some as well. Whereas the other brother only gave him of one food. He thought that's sufficient, that the waiter should eat something. Mor mishta'e ale Eliyahu behadeh, umor la mishta'e Eliyahu behadeh. The brother who shared with the waiter all the foods, Eliyahu would come and speak to him. He was on a holier, higher level, whereas the other sage who did just a minimum, gave him one thing to eat, he was not so pious, and Eliyahu did not come to speak with him. Hanhu tarten chasideh v'amri le Rav Mari ve'Rav Pinchas b'nei Rav Chista. So these two pious people, and some say we know their names, and they were Rav Mari and Rav Pinchas, the two sons of Rav Chista. Mor kadem safeh, mor me'acher safeh. One would give the waiter before the meal. Go and take, you take first. And the other one would say, everybody eat, all the guests eat first, and then you give the waiter later. The one who gave the waiter first, Eliyahu came and spoke to him. The one who made the waiter wait, Eliyahu would not come to them. So we learn from these examples, even though it may not be the letter of the law, it's proper and pious to allow the waiter to eat first from every dish. Okay, now a fun story. The Amemad and Mazutra and Rav Asher, these three sages, were sitting in the hallway of King Izgur. This is a Persian king, 399 to 420. And so this must have been a very important meeting, that they're meeting with the king of the whole Persian Empire. Halef Azil Aturanga de Malka. So he had the king's chief butler, he's the waiter, and he's passing around different foods, different dishes. Chazier Rav Asher lemor zutra. Rav Asher was looking at Mor Zutra and saw that Chavad Apeh's face was all white, because he was looking at the food and he really wanted and he couldn't wait. Shakal be'espaateh. So Rav Asher did him a favor, and he went as the waiter was passing to bring it to the king. The king should eat first. As he was passing, he stuck his finger in and took one of them and put it in Mar Zutra's mouth, so that Mor Zutra would feel revived. Anachle bepume. Amale afsadet leseudata de mal. The waiter, the chief waiter, said, you spoiled the king's meal, because the king is not going to eat from leftovers. The king has to have the first bite, and now you degraded the food and ruined the king's food. Amru le amay tabid hachi. And so the king's soldiers are there. What'd you do that for? Now they were all angry at him. He might be in trouble. Amar lehu man tabid hachi pasil ma'achal de malka. So Rav Asher turned it around on them and said, someone that does this, meaning makes such a terrible dish, you're the one that spoiled the king's food, right? Who is the chef that made this terrible food? Amru le amai. What do you mean? What's wrong with it? Amar lehu. Rav Asher says, Davar acher chazai be. I saw something funny in it, meaning there's some kind of sara'at, there's something spoiled in the food, and I was actually saving the king. Badku v'lashkechu. So they went and checked the dish, and they didn't find anything spoiled in it. So now Rav Asher is in trouble. Shakal esba'ateh anach aleh. So he put his finger in the food, and he said, Amar lehu hachami bedakitu. Did you check this spot? Bedku ashkachu. And then they checked that spot, and sure enough, they found that there was some mold, spoiled food there. Amru lerabanan ma'itama samacht anisa. After that, the rabbis recognized that he did a miracle, and we don't like to rely on a miracle just for a small thing like this. So, why'd you call down a miracle just for this? The rabbis asked Rav Asher. Malu hazai ruach sarateka parcha ilave. He says, I actually saw a leprous spirit over the food, and so I knew it has his defect. In other words, I was not relying on a miracle. I really saw there was something fishy about the food, that there was something wrong with it. And so he was able to save the day and save themselves, so that he wasn't the one that spoiled the food, but rather by taking it first, he actually helped find this spoiled food and help prevent the king from eating from it. All right, another fun story. A certain Roman man told a woman. We're not talking about any Jews here. It's funny, you don't usually find stories in the Talmud. Usually stories in the Talmud are about rabbis and Jews. This is just some Roman guy. Went to a woman and says, Minas batli, will you marry me? She says no. She rebuffed him. She doesn't want to marry him. So he went and got some pomegranates, and he's peeling the pomegranates and eating it in front of her, not sharing it with her. Now she is watching this, and she has a craving for it, and she is salivating and salivating, and she's every time she keeps swallowing her saliva. But he will not share it with her until she became ill, because she's swallowing so much saliva and is in such distress. She became ill and bloated. Now he says, listen, if I cure you, will you marry me? So she was in such distress. She said, all right, fine. Amar le'in, right? Anything, just get me better. And I'll marry you. Azel aiteri maneh. So he went and got more pomegranates, and you'd expect it to say, and he actually shared it with her, but no, because he had to undo the damage that was caused. Paleh v'achal kama. He again peeled them and ate and didn't share. Amar la kol mayad esari lach tuf shedai. But he said, this time when you salivate, then spit it out. Don't swallow it. Each time spit it out. You got to get it out of your body. Until some like a green leaf came out of her. That was the sickness. And then she was cured. And I guess they got married and lived happily ever after. Okay, so that's the end of the story. And now we go to the next item in the Mishnah, that she has to spin wool. We infer, since the Mishnah says wool, that yes, the husband can force his wife to spin wool, but not flax. Spinning flax is much more degrading and harder work, as we'll see. The author of this Mishnah must be Rabbi Yehuda. דתניא אינו כופה לא לעמוד לפני אביו ולא לעמוד לפני בנו. A husband cannot force his wife to show respect to his father or his son from a previous marriage. She has to show respect to the husband, but not to the other members of his family. ולא ליתן תבן לפני בהמתו. And she cannot force him to put straw in front of his animals. אבל כופה ליתן תבן לפני בקרו. But in front of his cattle, yes. So animals meaning horses and donkeys. That, number one, could be dangerous. Horses are harder to control. Whereas cows and bulls, cattle, I guess, easier. Also, cows and bulls are necessary for the household maintenance. They're doing things in the field, so she has to help out with the household. Whereas horses, that's for him to ride, is not really part of the household. So, for whatever various reasons. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af eno kofa lasot bepishtan. Here's the relevant part for us. Mipnei shepishtan masrichat hapeh umsharbet et hasefatayim. The husband also cannot force his wife to spin flax, because flax, while you're spinning it, they would have to wet the flax, and they would wet it with their mouths, and by doing that a lot, the flax causes bad breath and can cause the lip to swell, and so she doesn't have to put herself through that annoyance. But this is referring to Roman flax. That is the worst, does the worst damage. There are other kinds of flax that aren't so bad. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, the Mishnah says that even if she has 100 maidservants, she still has to do something, and she still has to spin the wool, because it's not good to be idle. Amar Rav Malkiyu, Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, halacha keRabbi Eliezer. So Rav Malkiyu says that is the halacha, that the husband can force her not to be idle, to do something, even though there are other people that can do it. Work itself is good for a person. Amar Rabbi Hanina bered Rav Ika, Shiput, Shefachot, Vegomot, Rav Malkiyu. So now we're going to just clarify. There's two rabbis with similar names, Rav Malkiyu and Rav Malkiya. We just quoted here Rav Malkiyu. And they both said that regarding three items, the halacha follows them. The halacha follows them regarding three items, and we want to clarify which they are and who said what, so we don't confuse their names. So this is what it is. Shipud, regarding a skewer that you roasted it, but now there's very little meat on it, and it's already not usable, it would be mukseh. Nevertheless, you can move it with a shinui, you can move it to the corner on Yom Tov to get rid of it. That was one halacha. Shefachot, that's our halacha that we just mentioned, that even if someone has many servants, she still has to do something to keep busy. Gumot is trying to decide when a minor girl becomes a na'ara, is when she has two hairs. Even if she just has two hair follicles, that's sufficient to become a na'ara. All those three were halachot that were said by Rav Malkiyu, whereas the following three were said by Rav Malkiya. Regarding a forelock, the idolaters would have some kind of hairdo. They had like a ponytail or front tail, and so if they went to a Jewish barber, he was not allowed to cut their hair with that forelock. Was not allowed. So they could cut the hair or the rest of the hair, but the Jewish barber was not allowed, had to leave 3 handbreadths of hair all around that forelock, and so as not to help out the idolater do idolatry. And efer makle ugvina, efer makle, burnt ashes. One of the therapy was to put burnt ashes on a wound, but that's also a similar way that people would make a tattoo. And so you're not allowed to make a tattoo, so you also can't use burnt ashes on a wound. And givina, regarding cheese made by Gentiles, not allowed because sometimes they put lard on the cheese. Those 3 halachot are said by Rav Malkiya. Okay, that's in the opinion of Rabbi Hanina bered Rav Ika. However, Rav Papa Amar, matnitin umatnita Rav Malkiya. He split up these halachot differently. See, even with all this effort to remember which 3 and which 3, there was actually a machloket anyway, which 3 they said. So Rav Papa says the 3 that are based on the Mishnah or Baraita, those were said by Rav Malkiya, whereas the ones that were said by an Amora Shemateta, those were by Rav Malkiyu. If you want to remember that, Simanech Matnita Malkata. It rhymes. The ones that are based on a Mishnah is Malkiya or Malkata, not Malkiyu, which doesn't rhyme. My benaihu, what item would be different between the two? Ike benaihu Shefachot. It's actually this very one, regarding the maidservants. According to the Bichanina above, this was said by Rav Malkiyu, but according to the Papa, this is something that's based in the Mishnah, and so he would say this halacha was said by Rav Malkiya. Okay, finally, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Hainu Tanakama. Rashbak says that if someone who vows that his wife is prohibited from doing any work, says, I prohibit my wife from doing any work, they have to divorce, and he has to pay her ketubot, because now she won't be able to do anything, even though he's saying, you can't do anything for me. Anything she does around the house is going to benefit him, and so then she won't be able to do any work, and she will be bored, and boredom, idleness is very bad. So they have to get divorced, because better divorce than for her to be idle. Now Rashbak is actually saying the same thing as Rabbi Eliezer, who also said that you have to do something. So what's the difference between them? Tanakama ikebanaihu de mitalela beguriyata kitanyata venadrashir. Difference between them is if she has something to do, like if she's playing with small dogs or playing with games. Nadrashir, some say it means chess, some say it means some game like backgammon. As long as she is occupying herself with something, then that's fine. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, this would still be a problem because he used the language of that doing idleness leads to zima, leads to licentiousness, promiscuity. And so this is not productive work, and therefore this would still be a problem. So that's why he said she still has to spin wool. Yes, she has to do something productive, not just play games all day. Whereas Rashbag just said that idleness leads to shimum, boredom. So it's just not good to sit around and do nothing. But as long as she is doing something, so even if the husband says, I prohibit you from doing any chores around the house, if she has a hobby and she likes to play backgammon all day, then that's fine. They would be able to stay married. All right, next Mishnah. Hamadir et ishto mitashmisha mita. Bet Shammai omerim shete Shabbatot, bet Hillel omerim Shabbat achat. A man makes a vow and says, I refuse to receive any benefit from the use of the bed. I will not have marital relations with you. They get into a fight, and so he says that. Now, how long is he allowed to do that? The problem here is that a husband has an obligation of onah. He has to be with his wife. It's in the Torah. It's in the Ketubot. So he's not allowed to make this for a long time. He could do it for a day or two. Because it depends on how often is the obligation of onah. That will be the subject of this Mishnah. So Bet Shammai omrim sheteh Shabbatot, Bet Hillel omrim Shabbat echat. Bet Shammai says the maximum is 2 weeks. If he says, I am not going to be with you, I prohibit you for 2 weeks or more, then he has to divorce her and pay the ketubah because he ruined the marriage. He's not fulfilling his obligation of onah. But if he says less than 2 weeks, then okay, they're in a fight. They will separate for a while, but that is within the bounds of the obligation of onah. Bet Hillel, I guess you could say is stringent, or depending on what perspective, stringent or lenient. He says only 1 week, that the husband has to be with his wife every week, and therefore that's the standard. So if he vows a prohibition for 1 week or more, he would have to divorce her and pay the ketubah. Okay, so now we're going to get into subcategories. The on misvah of onah is not the same for everybody. Depends on how often a person is around, depending on his job. Hatamidim yosin Talmud Torah shelo b'rshut sheloshim yom. Poalim Shabbat achaz. It also depends on what excuse they have, what else they're doing. So students can go and study Torah without permission of their wives for 30 days, even though they're skipping onah. We're going to see later on that a student studying Torah has to be with his wife once a week, Friday nights. Generally, so that's true. But if he's going to study Torah and he has to be away for a consistent period, if he's home, then he'll come back home. But if he has to go away, he can go away without permission for 30 days. If he has permission from his wife, then he can go away for even longer. Regular workers can go away to study Torah. We're going to see in a second. Usually regular workers have to be with their wives twice a week. But if they're going to study Torah, then they can go for an entire week, even without their wife's permission. The wife can't demand and say, hey, you have to be with me twice a week. He can say, I'm studying Torah, so once a week is enough. Ha'onam murabat Torah. Now here is the basic commandment that the Torah says how often a man has to fulfill onah. It depends on your job. Hatayalin bechol yom. People who are men of leisure, they have no job, so they have to be available to their wives every day. Po'alim shetayim b'Shabbat, regular day laborers, workers, they have to be with their wives twice a week. They might go for a job 1 or 2 days, but they're generally around. Hachamarim achat b'Shabbat. Hi, donkey driver, he's already going to have to go on some trips. He might be away for a couple of days at a time, and so he is required to be with his wife once a week. Hagammalim achat b'shoshim yom. Camel drivers, camel travel much further than donkeys, so they might be away for up to 30 days at a time on a long trip. So we cannot require them to be with their wives more often than 30 days, once in 30 days. Hasapanim, sailors are going on very long trips. Often they go and travel for months at a time. So therefore they only have to be with their wives ahad shisha chodashim, once every 6 months. Dibrei Rabbi Eliezer, that is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, Gemara will analyze. My tamad de Bet Shammai. Well, how come Bet Shammai says that a standard ona is going to be 2 weeks? So we learn this from a woman who gives birth to a girl is prohibited to her husband for 2 weeks. So we see that the Torah itself says that there will be cases where a man and wife cannot be together for 2 weeks, and that is sustainable, and that's tolerated. And so therefore, in other usual cases also, we can't demand, if the Torah says they are sometimes prohibited for 2 weeks, we can't demand that the husband be with his wife more often than that. Bet Hillel will focus on if a woman has a boy, gives birth to a boy, in that case, her period of being tumah and prohibited from her husband is only 1 week, and that's why he says 1 week. We question that. Bet Hillel nigmeru meoled nekeba. How come Bet Hillel doesn't also learn from Bet Shammai? The Torah does in fact say that a 2-week period for having a girl. So why wouldn't he not agree with that? So meoled gamri la hachiname ela Bet Hillel minida gamri la. You're right. If he's going to learn the 1 week from a woman who gives birth to a boy, then he would have to admit that sometimes it's a girl, and it would have to be 2 weeks. So scratch that. Actually, Bet Hillel is learning from Nida. Nida in the Torah has to wait for 7 days. 7 days altogether. So therefore, you see the Torah on a regular basis will prohibit a man and wife for 7 days. So you can't obligate him to be available more than once a week. Okay, how come one is comparing comparing ona to yoledet, to a woman who gives birth, and one is comparing it to a woman who's nida? Bet Hillel says we're going to do things that are common. Nida is very common. It's every month. Making a vow against marital relations is also common. I don't know, it's not so common now, but back then, people got into a fight, they would make these vows. So we compare these two items that are more common, whereas giving birth to a child, that only happens once every year, 2, 3 years, not so often. Bet Shammai's reasons that we should do something that the man caused. He causes the prohibition if he makes a vow. He causes a wife to become pregnant and give birth. So those are more comparable than nida, which just happens naturally. The man doesn't do anything to cause or prevent that. Amar Rav, machloket bimfaresh, aber bistam dibra kol yosi le'altar. So this machloket is between Bet and Bet Shammai is when he gives a set time for his vow. I vow that I will not be with you for 1 week, for 2 weeks. But if he gives it no time period and he just leaves it open-ended, I'm not going to be with you, then he has to divorce her immediately. Right then, v'yiten ketubah, and give a ketubah, because just at the moment he makes a vow, he already is violating the stipulations of the ketubah. Ushmuel amar afilu bistam namei yamtin shema yimsa petach lididro. Shmuel says no. Even if he doesn't give any time period, still he can wait for Bet Hillel. He can wait to divorce her up to 7 days. In other words, if he says 7 days, then everyone will agree that he doesn't have to divorce her right away. He can wait 6 days. It's only on the 7th day that will trigger the prohibition. Hey, you didn't fulfill your obligation. So then he has to give a ketubah. But if he doesn't say anything, Tanakama would say he has to divorce her right away. Shmuel says, no, you can wait, because maybe in the meantime, he will find some way of dissolving the the vow. If you can come to a bet din and find some extenuating circumstances, I didn't realize when I made the vow that this would be the case, and so we want to give him time to undo the vow, and that way they won't need to get divorced. We ask about that. This machlok between Rav and Shemuel. I said not Tanakama before. I said Rav. I said Tanakama. I meant Rav. Okay, this machlok between Rav and Shemuel. What they said this machloket here, but actually they already had this conversation, this controversy another time. Why do we need to learn about it twice? Ditnan hamadir et ishto melehanot lo ad sheloshim yom ya'amid parnas yoter mikan yosi v'yiten ketubah. So the Mishnah, later on, we're going to see this Mishnah soon. Someone who makes a vow that is against that his wife is prohibited from having any benefit from him or his property. I'm not going to take care of you. All my property is prohibited to you. If he makes a time period and he says, I will give no benefit to you for 30 days, well, then they can remain married because he can set up a trustee and the trustee will support her. So that way it's being done indirectly. The trustee will support her. And then after the 30 days, they'll figure out the accounts and they'll pay the trustee back. And so she will still get supported. And so he can continue fulfilling the obligation of his support of ketubah, even though he made this vow. But if he does it more than 30 days, then he has to divorce her and give a payment, because this is not a sustainable arrangement. Now that's the Mishnah. This that we say you can wait 30 days. That's only if he says a specified amount that this vow will go on for this amount of time. Okay, so then in the meantime he can use a trustee. But if he doesn't give any ending time, then he has to give her ketubah immediately, because by then, since there's no ending time, there's no end in sight, so he's violating the stipulation of the ketubah. Now he has to divorce now and pay a ketubah. That's Rav. Says even if he doesn't give if it's open-ended, it's a vow that goes on, nevertheless he can wait 30 days before he has to give her a divorce and pay the ketubah, because we want to give a chance for him to figure out a way to undo the vow. So we see that we learned the machlok between Rav and Shemuel already regarding another Mishnah. Why do you need to tell us that Rav and Shemuel also disagreed regarding this, in this case, this Mishnah, where he made a vow for 1 week or 2 weeks against marital relations? So we answer, if we only knew about this case where in our Mishnah he talks about a vow of marital relations, that's why Rav was stringent in this case, because you can't, there's no way to get around it. Regarding, if it's talking about sustenance, so sustenance he can provide through a trustee, but marital relations, he can't hire a trustee to have marital relations in his place. And so that's why we may think that Rav would be stringent only in the case of the vow against marital relations, that you have to get divorced right away. But when it comes to feeding her, where he's not violating, he can get around it with a trustee. So maybe he would agree with Shemuel that he can wait. So that's why we need that case in that next Mishnah to teach us that Rav is stringent even in that case. Well, on the other hand, if we only had that case regarding the vow against sustenance, where you can hire a trustee, maybe that's where Shemuel was lenient and said you can wait because you can hire a trustee in the meantime. But I might think that in this case where he makes a vow against marital relations, maybe he would be stringent, since you can't hire someone to do that for him, that he would say, yes, you have to divorce right away. So that's why I need this case also to teach me that Shemuel is lenient even in this case. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.